With Steve and rejoicing over the number that are here. Appreciate the desire everyone has to come out and study the Word of God on a Tuesday morning. And even more so, all the activities going on over here with the children's classes and what they're learning. That's really the most significant thing that's happening today. And appreciate so much the invitation again to be here and to participate, especially in these morning lessons with you. So we are in Daniel chapter 3 this morning. You can be turning your Bibles over there if you haven't already. Go through this introduction once again to the book of Daniel. Of course, we've got the three kings of the United Kingdom, Saul, David, and Solomon, the kingdom dividing in 931 into the northern kingdom of Israel, the southern kingdom of Judah. 722, Israel's taken into captivity, and then Israel in a series of deportations, finally in 586 being destroyed, the Jerusalem, the temple being destroyed. And that serves as the impetus in many ways for this book, because Daniel is in captivity himself, and he is giving comfort to those who are in captivity, assuring them that God has not forgotten them. He has not forgotten the promise that he made to David. They were not defeated because of God's weakness, but because of God's purpose. It was God who gave Jehoiakim into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, and it was God who ultimately allowed the Babylonians to come in and destroy the temple and destroy Jerusalem. And God's purpose and God's plan and God's promises were still going to come about, but it was going to be in his time. And that's what the book of Daniel is all about. We noted that Daniel's written in two languages, Hebrew and Aramaic. These chapters that we're really focusing on this week, mostly chapters 2 through 7, were written in the language of the empire, in Aramaic. And they give us kind of the three main themes of the book. The first in chapter 2 and chapter 7, we're unfortunately not going to be looking at these chapters this week, where we see in Nebuchadnezzar's dream of this great image made up of four parts representing four world empires, the Babylonians first. He was the head of gold, the Medes and Persians, Greek, and then Roman empires. That it was in the days of the Romans that rock that was cut without hands would strike the image. It would destroy the image, not a trace of it would be left, and that rock would become a great mountain that would fill the earth, and it would be an everlasting kingdom. And that was the fulfillment of the promise that was made to David. And again, chapter 7, different vision, but same point. These same world empires represented by these four beasts. The point being that God, in his time, was going to bring about his promise to David. Chapter 3 that we're going to look at this morning, and then chapter 6 on Friday, also have the same theme. And you've probably noticed some of the parallels between these two chapters before. And that is that God rescues those who are faithful to him, and he exalts them. With Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, I appreciated I forget who led the closing prayer, but he referred to them as Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. I think that's appropriate. I think they would appreciate that. But in chapter 3, we know them as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But God rescued them from that fiery furnace and exalted them. And the same story really repeated with Daniel and the lion's den in chapter 6. And then the center of the book really is this point that God is in control, and he is able to humble those who are prideful, first with Nebuchadnezzar and then with Belshazzar. These are similar stories, but they're different, and we'll note some of the differences. There's a lot of contrast that we can make, and we'll look at both of these chapters the next couple of mornings. And so that's the overview of the book of Daniel. You may have heard of the word pluralism before. We live in a pluralistic society. We live in a pluralistic culture. Pluralism is Can't read that in the back. It's a condition in which numerous distinct ethnic, religious, or cultural groups are present and tolerated in a society, or the belief that such a condition is desirable or socially beneficial. Daniel was living in a pluralistic society in Babylon. The first century Christians that were living in the Roman Empire, similar. And there were certain practical reasons for this. These large empires would go through and conquer people from various lands who worship different gods. And the objective for these empires was basically twofold: to keep the peace. They didn't want riots or uprisings to, threaten their power or control. And they also wanted people to pay their taxes because they depended on that money coming in to support the empire. And so what these empires would do is they would take a very pragmatic approach to religion. Because what do people get most upset about? Even today, what causes a lot of wars and fights and terrorism and things like that today? It's religion. And so these large empires made up of a consolidation of peoples and ethnic groups and religions would give people the freedom to worship as they wished. They could worship their own gods. Now, oftentimes they would decree, you also need to support our gods. And that wasn't wholly ideological. It was somewhat practical too, in that they wanted submission. Recognize that our gods defeated your God, was the point. But you could understand why these empires would be constructed in that way. And, incidentally, we are not a similar empire. It's not that we have gone out and conquered other nations and brought them as exiles against their will to the United States. But we are kind of a melting pot. And from the very beginning, it was kind of the ideals of the founding fathers that there'd be no state-imposed religion. People had freedom to worship however they wished. And so this is a good thing in a way, but you can understand where there would be negative side effects to this, right? Because if you tolerate all religions, kind of the underlying thought behind that is, well, then all religions must be equally valid. And there's the problem. And this is why the early Christians got into so much trouble. You know what they called the early Christians? Ironically, atheists. Because they only believed in one God. It's not because they didn't believe in any God, but they didn't acknowledge all the gods of the Romans. And so they were accused as being atheists. And Daniel chapter 3 that we're about to read, you see a similar tension. It's not that Nebuchadnezzar was saying, you can't bow down to your God. He's just saying, you have to bow down to mine. And so that presents the conflict and the tension of Daniel chapter 3. And Daniel chapter 3 gives us, in our pluralistic society, kind of a template to follow. I forgot to show this. That's what pluralism looks like. You've maybe seen that bumper sticker before. But that's the problem, is there's this idea that all religions are equally valid. And so let's read Daniel chapter 3 together, and we'll talk about how to survive in a pluralistic, postmodern world. So Daniel chapter 3. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold whose height was 60 cubits and its breadth was 6 cubits. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then King Nebuchadnezzar sent to gather the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces gathered for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And the herald proclaimed aloud, "You are commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace." Therefore, as soon as all the peoples heard the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, all the peoples, nations, and languages fell down and worshiped the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Therefore, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and maliciously accused the Jews. They declared to King Nebuchadnezzar, "O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music shall fall down and worship the golden image. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into a burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, pay no attention to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar, in furious rage, commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought. So they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said to them, "Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? Now if you are ready, when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, to fall down and worship the image that I have made, well and good. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God who we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury, and the expression of his face was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times more than it was usually heated, and he ordered some of the mighty men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their cloaks, their tunics, their hats, and their other garments, and they were thrown into the burning fiery furnace. Because the king's order was urgent and the furnace overheated, the flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell bound into the burning fiery furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up in haste. He declared to his counselors, "Did we not cast 3 men bound into the fire?" They answered and said to the king, "True, O king." He answered and said, "But I see 4 men unbound, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt. And the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods." Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the burning fiery furnace. He declared, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here." Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out from the fire. And the satraps, the prefects, the governors, and the king's counselors gathered together and saw that the fire had not had any power over the bodies of those men. The hair of their heads was not singed, their cloaks were not harmed, and no smell of fire had come upon them. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants, who trusted in him and set aside the king's command and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own God. Therefore I make a decree any people, nation, or language that speaks anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses laid in ruins, for there is no other God who is able to rescue in this way. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. Don't you love that story? I never get tired of it. Sometimes we read these stories and we think, well, that's for children's classes, right? It's for all of us. I tell you, I started this series when I heard a friend of mine teach it in Sierra Leone. We would take a book and we would just go through it, verse by verse. And this is one of the books we used a few years back. And he would always insist that the young preachers, who were really new converts, that they would read the stories themselves. And for some of these guys, this was the first time they had ever read this. And so this was all new to them, like a child hearing this story for the first time. And there was almost a childlike response. I remember as this brother was reading from Daniel chapter 3, he laughed a couple of times, reading this. It's just that, it's such a great, moving, inspiring story of faith and confidence in God bringing the victory in the end. I mean, you can't make up stuff like this. This is good stuff. And think about the fact that this is the reason that these chapters were written originally in Aramaic. Have you thought about that? Why would these chapters 2 through 7, be written in Aramaic? Well, it's because at the end of this chapter there was a decree that was to be sent to all nations. How are they going to read it if it's in Hebrew? That's the reason this was written in Aramaic. And chapter 4, by the way, was written by Nebuchadnezzar himself, almost as a tract, as a religious tract saying, hey, you need to notice this God. He is the Most High God. There's no other God like him. I mean, this is universal in scope. This is for all of us. And it's certainly applicable to us today because we're facing similar pressures in our world. And so how can we survive in a postmodern world? I want to notice 3 things about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that we can learn about. First of all, we learn that they knew what they believed. They knew what they believed. So, 3 times in this chapter, we have this statement. First of all, made by the Chaldeans to the king, then the king to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and then from Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's own mouth. They all say the same thing. These men, O king, pay no attention to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. The king kind of says this a 4th time near the end. Not exactly the same words, but the same substance. They knew that they could not do this, just like we looked at in chapter 1. Daniel and his friends were willing to make many concessions in this strange new world that they were living in. A lot of uncomfortable things, including answering to new names. But they knew there is a line that we will not cross. I don't care what the consequences are. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego understood what the consequences were, especially after the king's expression changed. But they were not going to bow down to that idol because they knew what they believed. And I'll tell you what's wrong, or one of the many things that's wrong in our day and time, is that we don't know what we believe. We don't know. When I moved to Tuscaloosa, I knew I was going to be working a lot with young people. We have a lot of college students there. And so I started reading a lot of books about millennials. And there's a lot of books that have been written about millennials. Probably the most written about generation of all time. And not all of the criticisms of this generation are fair, let me say that. And let me also say this in defense of our young people. We have some wonderful young people at Northwood. And you have some wonderful young people here. And I think the fact that the culture has become so bad makes them look even better, right? There aren't as many things in society supporting their faith as there were when we were younger, when we were their age. And so we need to encourage our young people and support them because it's not easy. And it's not easy because they're living amongst peers that just don't have any kind of foundation. They don't know what they believe. One of the books that I read that was the most helpful by far was a book by Christian Smith. I referred to another book that he wrote earlier this weekend. The first book I read from him, he's a sociologist at Notre Dame, was a book called Lost in Transition. And it's a book about the values of young people. And he did surveys where he didn't just ask yes or no questions, what do you believe, but why do you believe these? There were a lot of intensive, long interviews with young people to see really where they are. And it was these interviews that were most fascinating to me, getting to hear some of the samples of where young people are coming from. And there were different subjects. They talked about drinking. They talked about, sexual activity, different, politics even. But one of the earliest chapters was about just simply right and wrong. What is right and what is wrong? And a lot of the surveys came back saying what we already know. A lot of young people are just like, well, I don't know what's right or wrong. How can we say what's right for you may not be right for me, and what's wrong for you I may not see as a big problem? And so, what do you do? Let me read to you a quote from one young lady who spoke to how she sees right and wrong. She said, I don't know that people like terrorists what they do. It's not wrong to them. They're doing the ultimate good. They're just like they're doing what they think is the best thing they could possibly do, and so they're doing good. I had this discussion with a friend recently, and she's like, but they're still murdering tons of people. That just has to be wrong. And I was like, but do we have any idea if it is actually wrong to murder tons of people? Like, what does that even mean? Earthquakes murder tons of people, and I'm sure some people believe that God caused the earthquakes, and that means there was some purpose to them. They will just never know it. So you could say that people like terrorists are okay who somehow get brainwashed or born into cultures where they're taught that it's all right and necessary and really important for them to kill a bunch of people. In the grand scheme of things, that's just because like X amount of the population targeted needs to disappear. I don't believe that. But I could see that that could be an argument. So how do you feel about that? I mean, I don't know about you, but I'd be a little afraid to get on an elevator with someone like this. This is scary stuff. I mean, if you get to the point where in this very open-minded, tolerant view of right and wrong, get to the point where you can't say murder is wrong, that is a scary place for us to be societally. Where is the foundation then? Who could say that anything is wrong if that's the case? And you understand, this is why we do things like what we're doing this week. The reason why we are rejoicing in the fact that we have dozens of kids back here learning the Word of God is because this is what they're facing. And they need to be strengthened in the truth. And there is truth. There is right and there is wrong, and it is defined by God. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were taught, I believe, from a very early age, that you do not bow down to idols, no matter what. They knew where they stood. They knew what they believed, and we need to understand what we believe. Psalm 1, the very first psalm. Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked. And there's a lot of wicked counsel out there in the world today. Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of scoffers, but his delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law he meditates day and night. And he is like what? Like a tree that is planted by the streams of water. I remember going to Albuquerque one year and saw the Rio Grande. And Albuquerque is just it's beautiful. It's a different kind of beauty, but it is a barren wasteland. There are no trees. I mean, and it's hard to find any grass. There were a few little yards that had grass, and I'm sure they're out there watering it every single day, violating all kinds of water bans. But there's just no water in Albuquerque. But you go down to the Rio Grande, and that narrow stretch around the river, you got all these trees, all this vegetation. It's beautiful. But the only way those trees can survive is the source of water coming from that river. In this barren wasteland, they have nourishment. They have strength and support. And isn't that the way you feel living in this world? That's just dry and lifeless spiritually, surrounded by wickedness. You know, in the next verse he says, the ungodly are not so, but are like the chaff which the wind blows away. Think about the difference between chaff, which even a slight breeze would blow away as they were threshing the wheat, and a tree. Have you ever run into a tree before by accident? It's kind of startling. You know, you see the tree swaying in the wind, but you hit that pine tree, it doesn't move, and you're hurting. No, a tree is solid, it's firm, it stands fast, it's rooted in the earth. And that's Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They are standing tall. They're standing firm because they know what they believe. Their delight has been in the law of the Lord. They meditate on his word day and night, and they are that tree. Jesus uses a different kind of image in Luke chapter 8, where he gives the parable of the sower. He says, the ones on the rock are those who, when they hear the word, receive it with joy. But these have no root. They believe for a while, and in time of testing fall away. And so Jesus says there's going to be some people who will receive the word, and they'll be really excited about it. And yet they don't root themselves in the Word of God. And when those persecutions come, when they're facing the fiery furnace, they wilt. They don't know what they believe. They have nothing that's going to hold them down. Colossians 2 speaks to this. He says in verse 8, see to it that no one takes you captive by philosophy and empty deceit according to human tradition. There's a lot of empty deceit, lies out there in our society today. And there's a lot of philosophies that can take us captive. How do we ground ourselves and root ourselves? Well, in the previous verses he says, therefore, as you have received Christ Jesus the Lord, so walk in him, rooted and built up in him, and established in the faith, just as you were taught, abounding in thanksgiving. And so the exhortation to us is, if we want to stand like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, it's no secret. There's no mystery to this. This is not rocket science. We need to be reading and studying our Bibles. And we need to be spending more time in the Word than we are all this other garbage that's out there. I'm not saying it's wrong to read other books. It's not wrong to even sample books that may help us to understand better where people are coming from. I think that's a useful exercise. But let's make sure that we're spending the majority of our time hearing what God has to say and not men. We need to know what we believe so that we can stand firm. So they knew what they believed, and secondly, they stood for what they believed. I love their response to Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar was very clear. He's like, look, here is the way it is going to be. I'm going to give you one more chance. You can bow down, but if not, we're going to throw you right in there right now. I said, okay. Our God is able to deliver us. We're not going to worship your gods because we know what we believe. We're not going to serve them. And our God is able, and He will. And we'll talk about that more in just a minute. He will deliver us out of your hand. But they said, you know what? It may be that God will allow us to just burn. And they said, King, we're okay with that. We're prepared. We're prepared to die. If not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. They knew what they believed, and they had the conviction and the courage and the boldness to stand for what they believed. In this same book, Souls in Transition, by Christian Smith, he wrote a chapter on drinking. And drinking is a real problem on every college campus. It's a problem at Auburn. It's a problem in Tuscaloosa. All across the country. It doesn't matter where you are. There's going to be a problem with drinking. And he devoted a whole chapter just asking young people what their views about drinking were. When we went down for orientation to Camp War Eagle with the kids to enroll them in school, the subject of drinking came up. And we were separated from the kids. And what they're doing for us as parents is they're trying to assure us your babies are going to be okay. And so the subject of drinking came up. But at no point anywhere during all of our presentations, and I asked the kids later about theirs, at no point did anyone say, you cannot drink. It is illegal to drink when you come in as a freshman. It was just kind of understood they're going to drink. Nobody said that, but that was the clear implication. They're going to drink. And here's what we have in place to make sure that they don't get into terrible trouble with that. And so that's just the assumption. And to Christian Smith's credit, he asked the question that nobody seems to want to ask. Why drink? I want to read to you his comments about that. He said, consider, for example, the influence of normative culture. By this we mean the cultural scripts that tell people who are playing specific social roles, such as teenager or college student, how they should think, desire, feel, and behave. Somehow, for some reason, growing up in American culture usually entails being socialized into internalizing the cultural script that says that in middle to late adolescence, one needs to experiment with drinking and smoking and possibly with drugs. That script says that once a person leaves home, they need to exercise their new freedom by partying, acting wild and crazy, perhaps idiotically, particularly by consuming large amounts of alcohol and maybe some drugs. The script also says that eventually in one's late 20s and early 30s, one needs to stop this partying, settle down, and become a good, successful, financially secure family person. When I teach Introduction to Sociology, I spend 2 classes discussing the question, why intoxication? 2 whole classes. Why drink? At first, most students cannot even imagine the justification for even asking the question at all. Isn't it obvious? But when I push them, they essentially conclude something like this. Quote, the entire time we were growing up, we were taught that when you get to college, you're supposed to party, be wild, get crazy, have fun, drink a lot. Their answer, in short, is we do exactly what we're told to do. Note that these are otherwise bright people who profess to be, even insist that they are, autonomous and self-directing individuals, whom it can take a long time to convince sociologically that life is not simply about making individual choices. Yet many party like crazy and suffer the associated hangovers, blackouts, injuries, risky and meaningless hookups, and sometimes substance addictions because, they explain, it is what they've been taught to do in college. In some sense, it is a version of Aristotle's bovine existence, being lived out by otherwise very smart and promising young people. Such is the power of cultural norms, socialization, and life course scripting about people's individual choices. I mean, we're talking about Notre Dame. These kids had good ACT scores, I guarantee you, to get accepted. I had lunch with a recent graduate from Alabama and his new wife who graduated from Auburn on Monday. And we started talking about some of these things. And she graduated as a ChemE. They don't give those degrees away either. I mean, that is a tough major. And she said one of the last things they did, kind of the closing party for their class, and they did this with their professors, is they at the end of their little party, they had some awards given out to everybody for different things, kind of silly things. But at the end, they said, we're going to go bar crawling. You know what bar crawling is? It's where you essentially go from bar to bar and bar, and eventually you're crawling because you can't walk anymore. And the professors did this with them. They printed out T-shirts with the professors' likenesses on the back and 2017 bar crawl on the little front pocket. I mean, that's the culture. And there's a lot of pressure. Because that's what you're supposed to do. You're in college, don't you know? That's what everybody's doing, even the professors. But what about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Do you think that they were joined by dozens of other Hebrews and not bowing down? I don't know. We've always asked the question about Daniel. I'd like to think that Daniel didn't bow down. I don't think he did, based on what I know about Daniel. I've always kind of assumed he was just not there for whatever reason. But do we really think that they were surrounded by a lot of others who refused to bow down as well? I mean, it could be they were being pointed out, especially because of their positions in the kingdom. But you realize that sometimes you have to make a stand, not just under the influence of the world, but under the influence of those who call themselves Christians. And unfortunately, I know young people who have done just that and decided not to go to the bar when everybody else is going, including Christians. It's hard. But you know, it's not enough just to know what's right. You got to be willing to stand for what's right. I love what Joshua said. If it is evil in your eyes to serve the Lord, choose this day whom you will serve. He said, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. We're going to serve the Lord. I don't care what you do. My family doesn't care what you do. We know where we stand, and this is what we're going to do, even if we're the only ones. And Joshua had proven that before, that he was willing to stand alone, or at least with Caleb, when everyone else lost faith. I love 1 Corinthians 16:13. Be watchful, stand firm in the faith, act like men. The King James says, quit ye like men. Grow a backbone. Be strong. Don't just go along with what everybody else is doing. I mean, Jesus said that the gate is wide and the way is broad. Chances are, if everybody else is doing it, it's wrong. We've got to be willing to stand up and say, this is where I stand. And it doesn't matter what you do or what you threaten to do to me. I'm going to stand right here and be strong. And so they knew what they believed. They stood for what they believed. And they did it because they trusted in whom they believed. And let's get back to verse 17. They said, if this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us out of the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. Now it sounds like double talk when you get to the next verse, and they said, but if not, how can they say, he will deliver us, knowing that they may perish in this fire? Well, it's because they understood that ultimately the worst thing Nebuchadnezzar could do to them is kill them. But that's all he could do. They believed, as Paul wrote in Philippians chapter 1, that they would be delivered whether by life or by death. Either way, they know that God's going to deliver them. And that's the confidence that we can have because of the resurrection. Because Jesus has conquered death, death no longer is our master. We don't have to fear death anymore, Hebrews chapter 2. We don't have to be afraid of dying because we can have the confidence and the assurance that the worst thing man can do to us is take our lives. My son shows extraordinary courage when he's playing his little games, you know. Run out into danger, grenades and everything flying around. Why is he so courageous? Because he's not going to die. You die, what happens? You get another life. That's what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego believed. And they didn't have the resurrection like we do. They didn't understand it, certainly, as we do. There was some concept of afterlife. But we can stand in a way that they couldn't. We know what 1 Corinthians 15:58 says. Therefore, my beloved brothers, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that in the Lord your labor is not in vain. We can stand firm with the confidence and the assurance that that's all man can do to us, is take our life. He can't take what's most important to us. And so we need to know what we believe. We need to stand for what we believe, and we need to trust in whom we believe. And one more passage from 1 Peter chapter 5. Again, 1 Peter and Daniel, a lot of overlap, a lot of borrowing from the book of Daniel in 1 Peter. And he says in verse 6 of 1 Peter chapter 5, humble yourselves therefore under the mighty hand of God, so that at the proper time he may exalt you. Understand that you are never in that fiery furnace by yourself. You are never in that fire alone. There were not 3 men in that fire, there were 4. There were 4. And the 4th to Nebuchadnezzar seemed superhuman. And so, as you make that stand, and nobody else is standing with you, and you're looking really weird and feeling really awkward, the young lady who was the Kimmy, you know, she was the only one. And there were a lot of other Kimmies in her class that were very religious and very spiritual people, but they just went along with it. She was the only one. But she was not alone. And you're not alone. And the fact is, God has promised you that if you will humble yourselves in this trial, in this furnace, that in the end, just like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were exalted at the end of the story, so you will be exalted in the proper time. We're going to sing a song of invitation now, and this invitation is to you, that you might receive the assurance and the confidence that we have. Do you know what you believe? Do you know who Jesus is? Are you willing to confess him, and not just confess him here amongst those who agree with you, but confess him out there? Are you willing to say, Jesus is the Christ. He is Lord. He is raised from the dead. And are you willing, based on that confession, to yield your life to him? Literally, if necessary, to give up everything, even your own life, to follow him. You can be buried with him in baptism this morning, and you can walk out of here with the hope and the assurance that you have a life with him that's guaranteed, no matter what. Nothing man can do to you can take away that from you. And so if you're ready to receive this gift, why don't you come as together we stand and sing.